That's why we come to church. We need to remind ourselves of who we are and of who God is and how that works out. The story we're going to be looking at today is a fascinating story. It's one you've probably heard before. And I love just the mystery that's in the story. And I love the way in which we see God moving in kind of unconventional ways. How many of you still have your Christmas decorations up? Anybody? Yeah. We still have them up here, and it's an appropriate thing. We took ours down this weekend. Levi reminded me that Christmas is not over yet, and it's not. Did you know that? Christmas really begins on December 25th, and it ends on January the 6th on the church calendar. Do you realize that? You've heard the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, right? See, in our culture, the way Christmas works out is sometime in October, you start seeing Christmas decorations go up, right? This year, I remember seeing it even before Halloween, stores with their Christmas displays. But Christmas kind of officially starts on Black Friday in our culture. That's how it works out, right? Starbucks gets the red cups. Everything begins to kind of come together. The music is all Christmas in the stores. And so from Thanksgiving until Christmas Day, that's Christmas, right? And then when Christmas Day hits, it's all over. But in the church calendar, or on the church calendar, it's quite different. You see, Advent begins around Thanksgiving. Not Christmas, but Advent. And Advent is this season where we're anticipating the coming of Jesus, right? And this year we talked about his second coming and his first coming. And we anticipate, we look forward. And then when December 25th happens, actually on December 24th in the evening, we gather together and we light that Christmas Eve candle. And we came together in this place on Christmas Eve. And we said to each other, Christmas is here. And it doesn't stop there. Really, it goes on in the church calendar for 12 days, all the way up until January the 6th. And January 6th is what we call on the church calendar Epiphany. And today we're going to be talking about Epiphany, kind of kicking off Epiphany. And Epiphany is really the story of the wise men. And we're going to look at that together this morning. Now, much of the research that I'm using for this sermon today is from one of my professors at Northern Seminary, Dr. Charles Cosgrove, New Testament professor there. And some of the research that I'm using is from his work. Let me invite you to find a Bible. If you don't have one with you, you should find one in the pew in front of you. And turn as Patty Steigers comes and reads Matthew chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 12. I'm going to venture past that a little bit toward the end here, but we're just going to look at 1 through 12 together this morning. And then leave your Bibles open because we're going to study this text together. So go ahead and read there, Patty.
After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
All right. Thanks, Patty. This morning, we're talking about Epiphany. Now, you've probably heard that word epiphany before. Maybe you used it in a context like, I had an epiphany, right? I see something that I didn't see before. Now, if you look up this word in the dictionary, the first definition Webster gives is a Christian festival observed on January 6th, commemorating the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles in the person of the Magi, the 12th day. The 12th day of Christmas is Epiphany. But if you look at the second definition, I'll put this one on the screen here. This is what Webster says an epiphany is. It's a sudden, intuitive perception of or insight into the reality or essential meaning of something, usually initiated by some simple, homely, or commonplace occurrence or experience. You see, that's what Epiphany is, right? Our celebration of Epiphany has to do with that sort of thing. It has to do with the wise man looking for something and finding it in a very common place, right? Very humble place. They're looking for something extraordinary, but where do they find it? They find it in the home of a simple carpenter. Now, the tradition of Epiphany, the word Epiphany on the church calendar cannot really be traced before the 4th century. That's the earliest occurrence where we see in North Africa Christians holding the festival of Epiphany on January the 6th as they celebrate the Magi. So before the 4th century, the word Epiphany is not in the Bible. It's really a tradition that was birthed out of this understanding of the story, which is really moving from Advent into Epiphany, into Lent, and then on to Easter. So we're not very far into 2016 yet. So this morning, it's appropriate for us as we are searching and continuing to search for God's will, God's direction. And a lot of times we think of New Year as New Year's resolutions, right? All the gyms will be full next week, right? And they'll stay full for a few weeks. And then by February, it kind of tones down a little bit, right? Everybody kind of backs away from those New Year's resolutions. But this morning, the first Sunday of New Year, let's together ask God, what do you want from us in this new year? How are we searching for God, and what might God reveal to us? Now let's look at this story together. Again, a fascinating story in Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, where do they go first? They go to the king's house. They've seen this star, and the star signifies the birth of a king. And usually when kings are born, where are kings born? They're born in palaces. So they go to the palace to find the king. But there is no baby born in Herod's house. Now, Herod is interested in this deal, right? Because these guys know what they're talking about, right? They're wise men. They're magi. They've been studying the stars, and the stars tell them that a new king has been born. And if a new king has been born, and it's not in Herod's house, then Herod's rule and reign is in jeopardy. So Herod is concerned about this. Now, we're going to get to what Herod does about it in a few minutes here, but hold on to that part of the story. Let's think about the nativity scene for a moment. We have one here on the stage, and if I passed out crayons to you this morning, and I ask you to draw a nativity scene, how would you draw it? You might take your brown one and draw a stable, right? Maybe some animals. You might draw a star, yellow, maybe pointing down to the manger or the light coming down to the manger. You probably would draw Mary, Joseph, and the baby Jesus. You draw shepherds, and you would probably draw wise men, because you always see wise men in the nativity scene. But do you notice here that when it talks of the wise men, the Magi coming, it says on coming to the house, not a stable. And Matthew is the only one who records the coming of the Magi. And in Matthew's story, there are no shepherds where the Magi are. And the timeline even suggests, if you really work it out and think about it, it may even be a year or two since Jesus' birth in a stable when the wise men come. So you might go, well, gosh, we got it all wrong, right? Well, a lot of times we take the story and we kind of morph it together sometimes. Many of us think, Mary and Joseph, they traveled to Bethlehem, they had the baby, 2 days later, they pack it up, they go back to Nazareth, and it all happened in one scene. But in reality, it was a long process. Mary and Joseph likely stayed in Bethlehem for some time after Jesus was born. When the Magi come, it takes them a while. They don't just hop on a plane and fly for 3 hours, okay? They have to journey across a land. They go to Herod, take some time, and they finally make their way to Bethlehem. Now, who are these guys? Who are the wise men? Who are the Magi? The term Magi refers to a sage in an Eastern court. So the kings would have these people that were employed by the kingdom. They would advise the king, and they primarily were advising the king based on ancient wisdom. They would interpret dreams, and they would study the stars. And the stars for them were indications of what God was doing in the world. And so, as they're studying the stars, they see this new star. And they understand that new stars mean kings are born. And so they follow the star. They're bringing gifts. They're going to bring tribute to this new king. And they go where? They go to Herod. They go to the king's house to see if the king has been born there. Now, the Magi are probably not kings themselves. They are sages. But it's not inappropriate to call them kings because they are representing kings as they come. At least symbolically, they are standing for the kings of the earth, bringing tribute to Jesus. Where do they come from? Well, we really don't know. They come from somewhere in the east. It's very mysterious here. And again, they kind of come into the story. They're here for a moment, and then they disappear, and we never hear of them again. Now, how many Magi are there? Do you see in your text, does it say how many? It doesn't, does it? Now, many say there are 3 wise men because there are how many gifts? 3 gifts. And you're thinking, well, each one brings a gift. But other traditions say that there were as many as 12 wise men or 12 Magi. Others have given them names. In fact, in the Christian East, the names Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar are used for the 3 Magi. But according to another source, the Venerable Bede in the 8th century, who was a monk and a scholar, he says that the Magi symbolize Asia, Ethiopia, and Europe coming to Christ. So many different interpretations of who the Magi are and where they come from and how that all works out. The Bible only tells us that they come from the East. We read in Matthew chapter 2, verse 9, after they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So they're at Herod's place. They leave and they travel to Bethlehem. They follow the star there and they find Jesus and his parents. I mean, can you imagine this scene? Mary and Joseph in a humble carpenter's home, and all of a sudden these 3 strange guys show up, dressed in probably weird sorts of clothes, and they're bringing gifts. Now, Middle Eastern hospitality would have required that Mary and Joseph provide a meal for them, provide an overnight stay for them. So very likely the wise men or the Magi spent the night in the home of Mary and Joseph. Can you imagine the conversation Mary and Joseph would have had? Who are these guys? What are they doing here? They look pretty strange. It's been very common for the wise men, to speak Aramaic because that was kind of the common language in the Mediterranean world. And so they were able to communicate with Mary and Joseph. But as they possibly departed the next morning, you can imagine Mary and Joseph waving goodbye on their front porch, right? Going, who were these guys? Strange scene. But if you think about all that Mary and Joseph had been through, all the way back from the angel visit to the stable birth, to the shepherds showing up in the stable, and now these three magi appearing on the scene and presenting gifts. It must have been a kind of a wondrous, awe-inspiring sort of thing. And Mary and Joseph must have remembered that and have thought about, wow, God was moving. God was doing something. We didn't understand it. But here in Bethlehem, another mysterious thing is going on. Now let's think about the gifts that they bring. I mean, you think of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You don't really find that in the baby section at Babies R Us, do you? I mean, that's not the kind of gift you necessarily would bring a baby. But think about the meaning behind these gifts. The first gift is gold. Gold is certainly an appropriate gift for a king. Gold is the king of metals, right? The most valuable of metals. And so often if you were bringing the gift to a king, it would be of gold. And this teaches us, doesn't it, that Jesus' life and mission was one of a king. He would not be the sort of king, though, that would rule from a throne. He would rule from a cross. He would give his life for us, that sort of king. But he's a kingdom nonetheless, and Jesus is king nonetheless. The second gift is the gift of frankincense. Now, do you know what that is? Frankincense is what was used. It was a perfume that was often used in the temple. It was used by the priest. So this gift teaches us that Jesus is not only king, but Jesus is also priest. The word for priest is the word pontifex, and it means bridge builder. You see, Jesus had come not only to be our king, but he had come to build a bridge for us, a bridge between us and God. Again, the bridge would be made by a cross in which he gave his life for you and me. The third gift is the gift of myrrh. Myrrh was often a gift that you would bring to someone who was going to die. Seems like a strange gift for a child, doesn't it? For a baby. But it teaches us, and even in these early days, that Jesus had come to die, to give his life for you and me on a cross. You see, these gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they speak of who Jesus is and what he had come to do. I bet Mary and Joseph were a little puzzled maybe by the gifts, but in time they would make sense. In time, Mary would reflect back on the story and she would say, you know, I understand the gold, the frankincense, and the myrrh now. So what happens to these guys? They bring the gifts to Jesus, and where do they go? Do they go back home and tell others about Jesus? Tell others about the story? Did they ever see the man, Jesus? Did they ever understand that he came to die on a cross for them? We don't know. It'd be nice to think that maybe somewhere along the way, since God had pulled these men into his story, that maybe God revealed to them the rest of the story. But we don't really know that. We simply have one sentence. Matthew 2:12 says, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. That's it. That's all we have. That's all we know. And we never hear from these guys again. The story doesn't end there. I'll continue to read on in the story, and you'll see what happens next. Verse 13. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, he said, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, he took the child and his mother during the night and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet. Out of Egypt I called my son. You see, going to Egypt was not plan B. It was all a part of God's plan. It was not an accident. And you see, if you think of Egypt, Egypt is the symbol of Israel's enemy. But it's also a symbol of salvation, because you remember what happened in Egypt hundreds of years before Jesus showed up? God's people were enslaved in Egypt, and God rescued them. God delivered them out of Egypt. It all started with another Joseph going down to Egypt. Do you remember the story? That Joseph was sold by Midianite traders into slavery, right? He goes into Egypt, but in time, we see God had a plan in that, right? Because that Joseph rose to power in Pharaoh's court and was able to save the known world during a time of famine. Later, God would call a man named Moses to deliver his people out of Egypt. But here in this story, we have another Joseph going down to Egypt. In his care is God himself as an infant. God himself as an infant in the land where he delivered his people years before. You see, out of Egypt, the prophet said, I have called my son. And that will now be fulfilled through this. The helpless baby going to Egypt. Looking back at verse 16, we see what happens back in Judea. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious. And he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because they are no more. Tragic story here. While Jesus is in Egypt, safe from Herod's grip, in Mary and Joseph's care, Herod goes into Bethlehem and kills all the baby boys under 2 years of age. As Matthew thinks of this, he thinks of Rachel, who is said to be buried just outside of Bethlehem. He pictures her weeping. It's a phrase, and it's understood when Jewish mothers lose children. Rachel weeps. Matthew quotes the prophet Jeremiah 31:15. A voice is heard in Ramah, mourning and great weeping. Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted because her children are no more. What a tragic story. We think about this story, the wise men, Herod, the baby Jesus, Mary, Joseph. And we ask ourselves, where are we in the story? And what does this story have to do with us? Think about this for a minute. It challenges us, doesn't it, on how we approach Jesus? Think of Herod for a moment. Herod had every opportunity to worship Jesus. He had every opportunity to go as the wise men and find Jesus. But Herod was too concerned with his own deal. He was too concerned with his own plans, with his own agenda. He saw Jesus as a threat and wanted nothing to do with him, only to kill him. And the wise men, think of them for a moment. They traveled a great distance. Why did they travel? They traveled to bring gifts to Jesus, to bow down, to worship him. And you know, as I think about this story, and as we think about Epiphany, and as we think about this new year, and we think about all that God is doing, I want to ask the question this morning, are we more like Herod in the story, or are we more like the wise men? Are we worried that Jesus is going to get in the way of our plans? Do we push him to the side, and even worse, do we push him away and even kill him? Or do we humbly bring gifts to him? You might remember the final verse of the song, "What Child Is This?" I'll put these words on the screen. So bring him incense, gold, and myrrh. Come peasant king to own him. The King of Kings salvation brings. Let loving hearts enthrone him. This morning, as we think of this story, do our hearts enthrone him? Do we make him king, or are we fighting to be king? Are we willing to travel great distances and lay our gifts at the feet of Jesus and worship him? Do you notice the word worship is there? What do the wise men do? They worship him. I think this is a fascinating story, don't you? I mean, these Eastern kings who are not in the Jewish tradition, God points out to them a star in the sky, and they're attentive enough to follow that star. And when they see the baby, they bow down and they worship him. I love that. So unconventional, isn't it? But yet they're obedient, they're following, they're seeking, they're looking for God. Is that the posture that you and I have this year? Or are we more like Herod, wanting to stamp out what God is doing because it might get in the way of our plans? This morning, we're going to come to the table together this morning. I think it's a great way to start the new year, as we remember that Jesus was not simply a baby born. You know, that's all some people know of Jesus. He's a baby born in a manger. That's it. We're going to get into a season of Epiphany. We're going to start next week with Jesus' baptism, and we're going to walk through the ministry of Jesus, heading toward Lent and Easter, and understanding that the baby who was born in a manger came to die for us on a cross. We're going to walk through that story together over the next few weeks. But as we prepare to do that, we're going to come to the table this morning, and we're going to remember that the baby in a manger gave his life for you and for me. As the band comes forward this morning, I'm going to serve them first, and then I'm going to ask you guys to come as God would lead you. As we gather here, we take these two elements, the bread and the wine. These are two elements that most of us would consume at any meal if we were living in Jesus' time, because everyone drank wine at every meal. Everyone broke bread at every meal. And as they took these elements, Jesus took these elements on the night that he was betrayed. He broke the bread. He looked at his disciples, his friends, and he said to them, I want you to remember my body broken for you. He took the wine, red, blood-colored wine, and he said, I want you to remember my blood was shed for you. And here, 2,000 years later, we gather and we remember that Jesus' body was broken for us and his blood was shed for us. If you're here this morning and you can confess that his body was broken for you, that his blood was shed for you, you're invited to come and participate with us this morning. I'm going to serve the band first, and then I'm going to invite you to come and receive.